Paris, 1889. The Eiffel Tower pierces the sky for the first time, a monument to human achievement. But 32 million visitors aren't just here for Gustave Eiffel's iron marvel. They're here to see something else entirely. In the shadow of this symbol of progress, 400 African men, women, and children are living in reconstructed villages, performing their primitive daily lives for European audiences who pay to watch them like animals in a zoo. This isn't fiction. This is history. Between 1870 and 1950, over 35,000 people from Africa, Asia, and the Americas were exhibited in more than 400 human zoos across Europe and North America. They were advertised as living proof of human evolution. They were bought, sold, and displayed for profit. Their names were erased, their dignity was stolen, their humanity was denied. But who were these people? How did civilized Europe justify turning human beings into living museum pieces? And why has this chapter of history been buried for so long? The answers will disturb you. They should. To understand how human beings became exhibits, we must first understand the Europe of the 1870s. Charles Darwin had published On the Origin of Species in 1859, forever changing how humanity understood itself. But European scientists weren't using his work to understand evolution. They were using it to justify something far more sinister. Carl Linnaeus had already classified humans into racial categories in 1758, ranking them from inventive Europeans to crafty Asians to indolent Africans. Now, with Darwin's work twisted beyond recognition, Europeans convinced themselves they were witnessing human evolution in real time. European colonial powers seized upon evolutionary theory, perverting it to create a hierarchy of human worth. At the top, white Europeans, the supposed pinnacle of human development. At the bottom, indigenous peoples from colonized territories, portrayed as living fossils, evolutionary remnants of humanity's primitive past. This wasn't just racism. This was racism dressed up as science, given academic respectability, and turned into profitable entertainment. The architect of this human horror show was Carl Hagenbeck, a German animal trader who had built an empire capturing wild animals for European zoos. By 1870, Hagenbeck controlled the global exotic animal trade, but animals alone weren't enough. He had a more disturbing vision. What if Europeans could see not just exotic animals, but exotic humans? This template for a human exhibition had been established decades earlier in the tragic story of a young African woman whose suffering would blueprint 70 years of human exploitation. The year is 1810. A ship arrives in London carrying Saartjie Baartman, a young Khoi woman from South Africa, barely 20 years old. Her captors promised her riches in Europe. Instead, they turned her into the Hottentot Venus, a spectacle of human degradation. For 5 years, Saartjie was paraded through the music halls of London and Paris. She was poked, prodded, and measured by scientists who claimed to be studying human racial differences. She was forced to perform in front of crowds who laughed at her body and threw coins at her feet. When the African Association took her captors to court, arguing she was being held against her will, Saartjie was forced to testify under the watchful eyes of her exploiters. Could she speak freely? The court ruled in favor of her exhibitors. She died in Paris in 1815 at age 25. Even in death, she found no peace. French anatomist Georges Cuvier dissected her body and displayed her skeleton, brain, and genitals in the Musée de l'Homme until 1974. It would take until 2002, 187 years after her death, for Saartjie Baartman's remains to be returned to South Africa for proper burial. Her story became the template: lure indigenous people with false promises, display them as scientific specimens, profit from their suffering, and justify it all as education. The Berlin Conference of 1884 to 1885 would industrialize this template. As European powers carved up Africa among themselves, they also created a systematic pipeline for human exhibition. Hamburg, Germany, 1874. Carl Hagenbeck opens the world's first commercial Völkerschau, literally people show. His subjects, a Sami family from northern Scandinavia, displayed alongside reindeer in what he called their natural habitat. The response was electric. Thousands of Germans paid to stare, to point, to feel superior. Hagenbeck had struck gold, human gold. By 1876, he had established what he called anthropological zoological exhibitions. The name itself reveals everything: humans and animals displayed together for the same purpose. Hagenbeck's business model was simple but devastating. He would contract with colonial authorities to recruit people from recently colonized territories. These weren't volunteers. These were people whose lands had just been seized, whose governments had just been overthrown, whose economies had just been destroyed. The contracts promised good wages and safe return home. Most were lies. London, 1877. The Royal Aquarium, where Londoners typically came to see fish, now housed something unprecedented: the first major African exhibition in Britain. 11 Nubians from what is now Sudan were displayed alongside reconstructed huts, performing traditional activities for paying customers. The London Times called it a most interesting ethnological exhibition. But what the newspapers didn't report were the names of these 11 people. They didn't report that they were professionals, blacksmiths, traders, farmers, who had been told they were traveling to London as cultural ambassadors. Paris, 1889. The Exposition Universelle became the largest human exhibition in history. 400 people from French colonies were displayed in a colonial village that stretched across 15 hectares. 28 million visitors made the human exhibitions the most popular attraction after the Eiffel Tower itself. Chicago, 1893. The world's Columbian Exposition featured the Dahomey village, with 69 people from what is now Benin. Among them was Prince Ouanilo, son of King Glele of Dahomey. He spoke 3 languages, had managed international trade relations, and was more educated than most of his American audiences. Yet Chicago newspapers described him as barely human and a curious specimen of undeveloped humanity. How had a prince become a zoo exhibit? St. Louis, 1904, the ultimate exhibition. 1,200 people from around the world, including the most shocking display yet. Ota Benga, a Congolese man who had survived genocidal violence in the Congo Free State, was housed in the monkey house and displayed alongside chimpanzees and orangutans. Ota Benga was not primitive. He was a skilled hunter, devoted father, and spoke multiple languages. But to American audiences, he was simply another exhibit. When transferred to the Bronx Zoo, the New York Times reported that crowds gathered around the cage and there were shouts of laughter. No country would weaponize human exhibitions more cynically than Belgium under King Leopold II. In 1897, the Brussels International Exhibition featured Leopold's masterpiece of propaganda, a Congolese village inhabited by 267 real people from his private colony. Leopold had a problem. International critics were questioning his brutal rule in the Congo. He needed to change the narrative. The exhibition was a theatrical lie. The Congolese were housed in artificial huts, given costumes, and forced to perform for crowds of curious Belgians. But reality leaked through the fiction. 7 exhibited people died during the exhibition: 5 from pneumonia, 1 from tuberculosis, and 1 from nervous exhaustion. 7 people died to provide entertainment for Belgian audiences. Yet here's what the newspapers didn't report. The surviving Congolese organized what colonial records describe as a work slowdown. They refused to perform, demanded better conditions, and threatened to return to Congo. The Belgian colonial administration was forced to negotiate. The performers won improved meals, warmer clothing, and limited freedom. It was a small victory, but it was a victory nonetheless. Behind the carefully constructed facades lay a different reality. The exhibited people lived in overcrowded, unsanitary conditions with inadequate food and medical care. By 1900, death had become routine. Medical records show mortality rates of 10 to 15%, far higher than the general population. The causes were predictable: pneumonia, tuberculosis, and what doctors called melancholia, severe depression. Women faced additional horrors: sexually exploited by organizers and visitors who saw them as exotic objects rather than human beings. Most received little or no payment, trapped by contracts written in languages they couldn't read. Yet throughout this era, exhibited people were never passive victims. They resisted, they protested, they asserted their humanity in whatever ways they could. The most powerful resistance came from their determination to maintain their humanity. They preserved their languages, their customs, and their connections to each other. They found ways to practice their actual religions, to tell their real stories to sympathetic visitors, and to support each other through trauma, the fake science behind it all. European scientists used exhibitions to justify racial hierarchies. Paul Broca measured skulls to prove European superiority, but his measurements were systematically fraudulent. When measuring European skulls, he added lead shot to increase weight. When measuring African skulls, he removed all foreign material. This fraud wasn't discovered until the 1970s, long after his theories had justified decades of exploitation. European audiences themselves began to resist. Religious groups filed complaints, journalists wrote critical articles, and growing numbers of Europeans became uncomfortable with human exhibitions. The horror of World War I changed attitudes toward human dignity, while the Russian Revolution challenged assumptions about racial hierarchies. The 1931 Paris Colonial exhibition would be the last great human zoo in Europe. World War I had traumatized Europe, challenging notions of European superiority. How could the most advanced continent destroy itself so completely? The Holocaust showed Europeans the ultimate consequence of racial science, the systematic murder of millions deemed unfit by racial ideology. After 1945, human exhibitions became impossible to justify. The last major exhibition closed in 1958, marking the end of an era that had lasted nearly a century. But what happened to the survivors who returned home? Many struggled to readjust, disconnected from their authentic traditions after performing fake versions for so long. Children raised in exhibitions felt like strangers in their own communities. Some survivors never spoke about their experiences, carrying trauma in silence. Others became advocates, using their knowledge of European languages to protect their communities from further exploitation. Their testimonies reveal not just physical suffering, but psychological trauma that lasted lifetimes. These stories remind us that the line between civilization and barbarism is not where we think it is. It's not between different races or cultures or continents. It's between those who recognize the humanity in others and those who refuse to see it. The people who built and visited human zoos believed they were the most civilized humans on Earth. They were wrong. The people they exhibited, who maintained their dignity in the face of systematic dehumanization, who resisted oppression however they could, who asserted their humanity against impossible odds, they were the ones who understood what civilization actually means. The question isn't whether we've moved beyond the era of human exhibitions. The question is whether we've learned enough from that era to prevent something similar from happening again. The answer to that question will determine not just our past, but our future. Their names may have been forgotten, but their humanity endures. And in remembering their suffering, we honor not just their memory, but our obligation to ensure that such horrors never happen again. We are all human. We always have been.